digitaljamsessions.com. Hello and welcome to this Digital Jam session. Today we're joined once again by Amelia, and this week we have Tanya with us, and I'm going to let these lovely ladies explain exactly who they are and what they do. And I'm going to start with you, Amelia, because you've been before. We're going to see what variation that you're going to explain yourself with today.
Yeah, it's getting interesting. I'm just starting to run out of ways to reintroduce myself. From now on, I'm just gonna say that I'm a regular guest star at Digital Jam, first of all. And second of all, I'm an engineer that worked as an editor for Glamour magazine and got stuck in the fashion twilight zone ever since. I've worked a lot with startups from all kinds of positions. And the past few years, I've been working independently as a consultant, mostly around innovation in fashion tech.
Wonderful, thank you. And Tanya, why don't you explain more about what you do in Australia?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a serial entrepreneur and a social entrepreneur. I'm also a creative innovation catalyst. I'm a soprano. Yes, I sing. And I've founded 2 charities and 5 businesses and counting, particularly in the creative industries. And what else do I do?
Isn't that enough? That's a whole heap right there.
And I'm an inclusionista. That means I'm very passionate about social inclusion.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, I feel like I should briefly explain today where people are situated, because I feel like this is a truly global, international conversation today. So with myself in the lovely wilds of London, Amelia in Greece, and yourself, Tanya, in Australia, I feel like we've got a nice international coverage today. But what I wanted to do was talk today about innovation and the culture of innovation, because we're hearing a lot about this lately, about this idea that entrepreneurship is very much a culture and innovation is very much a culture now that has become much more intrinsic to the way that people think and the way that people operate. And Tanya's a great example of this in as much as you're a serial entrepreneur. And to say that phrase nowadays isn't something that people kind of look at you in confusion anymore. They kind of understand what that necessarily means, because I think previously, for a certain generation, when you said you was an entrepreneur, that's something you did once. You had a successful business and you went on to make that thing into a big corporate machine, and maybe you would exit at some point in the future, but it was really that one business that you would kind of do that thing and be known for that thing. But nowadays it's quite common to spin up numerous businesses and to move beyond that initial experience. And I think, Amelia, you've mentioned this before in previous conversations, that entrepreneurship is seen now very much as a learning process. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this one, Tanya, in terms of what you think are those key cultural shifts that have led to this idea that innovation and entrepreneurship really are just a learning curve.
For a start, as you said, entrepreneurs have also become much more accepted. So I don't know so much in other countries, but certainly in Australia, entrepreneur was never something that you proudly would say until recently. And now we have a Prime Minister who's talking all about entrepreneurship and innovation. And we're going to have to create a lot more people who can make and create things than we have in the past, because 47% of middle-class jobs estimated are going to be lost over the next few years due to robotics and new technologies. So the robots are truly coming. And what that means is that we need to actually skill people up to have the creative and innovative capabilities to be able to start their own businesses, to solve some of the global and community and organisational challenges that we're facing. And really, we haven't had a system that has been training people with those skills enough up till now.
I'm curious, Amelia, from your perspective, because we literally have just spoken about this quite recently, but this idea that actually for a lot of these kind of entrepreneurial types who are in this kind of headspace at the moment, working and when we work and how we work isn't necessarily something we perceive as work anymore. We go on holiday, it's not really holiday, it's us still working, we're still taking meetings, we're still reaching out to interesting businesses. Even when we're going on these supposed holidays, they become more like a business trip, because actually we're always switched on to opportunity. And I'm curious, Amelia, what your thought is on that in terms of this kind of new cultural thinking that we have as entrepreneurs.
Yeah, I think it definitely is something new. It all started a little bit with the Google and the Google way of life, where you had Zooms and all that within your office. And you started to not really be clear about where your office life ends and where your home life starts. Also, in the way, even with recruiting, a lot of entrepreneurs like Tanya from Zappos have said, I just take the guy that I want to hire out for a drink, and if we vibe, it's okay. So I think these borders between the office life and the personal life are starting to get way, way more blurry. And we also see that even with co-working spaces, that now we have a lot of co-living spaces for startup people as well. We work gonna launch the We Live.
That's kind of scary.
And we also have a lot of startup houses around Europe where entrepreneurs just team up and rent a house, so you can have that way of life when you can share things. And you also have the startup retreats, which is also a new trend where you can just find a retreat to take your team and you can all work out from Morocco during the winter or something like that. I think the problem is that we may be getting a little bit too homogeneous as a culture. And that whenever you get to homogeneous, that drives innovation right out the window. And I think in a sense, the startup community has become less innovative. As soon as it became a mainstream thing of our culture, it just simply took out the cool factor out of it. I know geeks are uncool by definition, but whatever is a little bit edgy, that means that you have something new to explore. When everybody has the same background, lives the same way of life, it's hard. That's why I like the intersection of technology with other industries, because when you get a mix of talented people, that's where you get fresh ideas, things out of the box. If it's only startup people, blah, 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 it's like it's getting a little bit too boring. A lot of startups at the time were asking me, before there was anything in Europe really, were asking me, should we move to San Francisco? And I was like, hell no, I went there. It was so boring. Maybe you should try another place. I think Australia is great, for instance. It's just right at the edge. So you can probably get some very good edgy ideas over there. I think it's necessary
we're definitely
to try.
on the edge.
Necessary to travel and go where the business is, but it's also equally necessary to take yourself out of that same and the same thing. Even at hackathons, you always hear the same pitch. It's like, I've heard this pitch a gazillion times ago. Just because people are in this mindset, they see the same things over and over. They all read tech runs. They all read TechEU. They all read the same stuff. They get the same inspiration, and they all want to please investors. So they come up with pretty much the same ideas.
It's interesting that you say this, and first of all, just in defense of all geeks around the world, I am a geek myself, so I feel I have to say geeks are cool in our own way. We don't need to be endorsed by everybody else as being cool.
Yeah, geeks were cool because they were doing their own thing, but now geeks are almost mainstream,
Okay.
No, I was just going to say, just following on from that previous commentary, my whole philosophy around building a culture of innovation is around what I like to call positive human collisions. And as was stated, we all talk, dress, think like one another. We have similar educations and backgrounds. And I believe, and this is well proven, that innovation and creativity can only spark when we have creative abrasion, where people actually do feel uncomfortable, get out of their comfort zone. They do disagree with one another. They might have some conflict. And that's where creativity and innovation can really spark. And it's true that a lot of, let's call it startup people, geeks, do hang out together. And so, in fact, we're just about to launch a new co-working space in Melbourne, Australia called Dimension 5. And we're actually going to bring together a much broader range of people than just typical, say, technical startup type people. We're going to bring together social entrepreneurs and social innovators and not-for-profits and small teams from large businesses, as well as some startups. But the idea is to create a real space for positive human collisions to happen, because I don't believe that innovation can happen when we're too similar, no matter, even if we're very creative and very innovative. If we're too similar, we won't innovate.
That's so true, and I take on board exactly what you're saying, Amelia, in terms of there does feel like a little bit of a carbon copy kind of approach nowadays to certainly things like hackathons, for example, where it does feel like everybody's kind of doing the same thing again and again. And I'm curious to understand, perhaps from your perspective, Tanya, what you feel is needed to really spark the next stage of innovation when you are in that environment where there are so many people who are doing the same things and talking in the same ways and all kind of trying to operate in the same way.
Yeah, I think what that comes down to is really deliberately creating places and spaces and organizations that really embrace social inclusion. So we bring together many people of all generations, of all cultures, all faiths, with disabilities, with disadvantage, with those more fortunate. We do this in my charity, Creativity Australia, where we bring together CEOs, doctors, lawyers, teachers, so fortunate people, with migrants, job seekers, people with depression and disabilities. And once you start to realise that actually I could be the person who's come from a war-torn place like Cameroon, or I could be the person with cerebral palsy in a wheelchair, you start seeing the world from their perspective and some of the challenges they face. That actually brings about a much more creative and innovative culture, because people start to ask one another. We have a wish list program where people can make wishes to one another for what they need in life. And all of a sudden you start thinking, oh my gosh, how could I solve that problem differently? We have like massive problems in the world now in terms of social welfare, where the divide between those who are well off and those who are disadvantaged is growing all the time. And that's probably going to grow more and more as more and more people will become unemployed. And the challenge is, what are we going to do about that? And I think that when you bring together very diverse people in this way, and not just the usual suspects, not just people who are of a certain generation doing hackathons together and so on, it's like all of a sudden the game changes. And you start to see yourself as part of this universe, this community, and everyone's voice is part of that community, but a lot of people are silenced or their voices go unheard. And I think it's about how we're going to include the very diverse people, and that's going to bring about innovation, because we're going to have to solve what we're going to do with the growing amount of people who can't keep up with all this innovation and technology.
It's interesting what you're saying, because I think the thing that kind of comes out the most from what you're saying there is the need for empathy. And I'm curious, Melia, from your perspective, do you feel like empathy is an engine that we can get behind here in the UK?
Yeah, I think so. And I think diversity is key for innovation. I mean, apart from the ethical dimension and whatever we talk about women in tech as well, it is important, because otherwise you will end up with just staff that are very limited. If you all have the same background, the same experience, the same view of society, it's hard to make something applicable to a broader audience, first of all. But also, you can't get different perspectives. I think it's also a lot when it comes to hiring people. A lot of entrepreneurs want to hire somebody that fits the culture, but sometimes they take a superficial approach and they just hire mini-me's. But you don't need people to high-five you, especially when you're building something. I think what Tanya mentioned about the positive collisions and positive conflict is very important. You need people to disagree with you, and they can bring something else on the table, and that's where good things happen.
I'm interested to hear from both of you in terms of the conflict and talking about that kind of creative abrasion, if you like. What you feel are the key trends that are emerging that might be considered as potentially abrasive to the innovation or to the culture of innovation that's developing at the moment? In terms of right now, we are dealing with things like funding opportunities for entrepreneurship and looking at training and education as key factors around innovation. What do you feel are the big key factors that might be something that needs to challenge this idea of creating entrepreneurship and creating innovation?
I think, as we said, mentioned diversity about before, it also falls with funding as well. There's been a lot of talk about the lack of women partners in a lot of venture firms, or essentially diverse people. If you only hire white guys that are Ivy League school graduates and have done 2 years of consulting to join a VC firm, and these are the guys deciding the money flow in this industry, sooner or later, you're gonna have a problem, because usually investors, of course, they hear everybody, they meet a lot of startups, but personal connections is a very big source for their deals. So it creates a limited view, or they perhaps can't understand people with different backgrounds or people that have a different cultural, racial, or any kind of background, really. So I think it's important also to make sure that the money flow can also go to all directions.
Absolutely. And Tanya, I'm not as familiar with the funding cycles in Australia, but what is the process in Australia by comparison to somewhere in Europe?
Look, funding any startup in Australia has been traditionally very tricky. We don't have as many angel investors and the whole sort of venture capital landscape that may exist in some other parts of the world, obviously particularly in Silicon Valley or in Israel, the obvious hotspots for this. But now that we have a new Prime Minister who's just announced like a $1.2 billion national innovation scheme, just last week in fact, there's a whole lot more support and money and incentives going into this system. Now, it remains to be seen how that's going to be implemented, but it's certainly creating a really huge vibe in Australia. I have never heard the words innovation and entrepreneurship mentioned so often every day in conversations in the newspaper. It's really exciting. So if nothing else, there's an enormous energy around this, and all of a sudden, innovators and entrepreneurs have become sexy. It's really good. So that's going, and the money will follow that. So it's going to be exciting, but I agree also with Melly that it's got to be a much broader range of people, again, who are deciding on how things are funded. And, you know, as I mentioned before, I'm a social innovator, as, you know, social entrepreneur as well as a normal, more commercial entrepreneur. And I think that often what happens is people get very focused on how they're going to make a lot of money and then they're going to have their IPO or their sale of some kind and their exit and so on. Whereas actually I think it would be wonderful if more of these wonderful entrepreneurs and innovators actually looked and from the beginning of their business plan start thinking, well, so how am I going to solve some of the social problems that are out there? And how am I going to have lots more diverse people on my board of all generations, all backgrounds and all faiths?
Interesting. I think there are quite a few challenges that need to be faced when it comes to developing an innovation culture and an entrepreneurship culture within a territory. But I think in your case, Tanya, you've gone a long way to doing that with the Creative Innovation Conference series that you've had going on for quite a few years now. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about how that all came about?
Yeah, the Creative Innovation Conference in Australia has become, I guess, known as the leading innovation conference in the Southern Hemisphere. So we bring together 8 to 10 global innovators and entrepreneurs from around the world and about 30 Australian innovators, entrepreneurs, leaders for a 3-day conference. And we've done this for 5 years now, and we're focused on topics like superconnected world, how to manage disruption. The next one in November 2016 will be called the Exponential Shift, Making Transformation Happen. And basically the whole aim of the conference is to deliver strategies, tools, tips, to hear from some of the leading innovators around the world on what they've done to not only create a culture of innovation, but to build organizations and projects that are truly innovative and that are game-changing. And one of the biggest things that have come out from that has been obviously around these concepts around positive human collisions, which we've been talking a lot about, and diversity, which we all agree about on this conversation, but also the concept, of course, of failing fast and experimenting, which is at the heart of any kind of disruptive innovation. And so, again, in Australia, we tend to be pretty risk averse, and no one likes to fail, but failure is very much a part of any entrepreneur's journey. You'll never hear any successful entrepreneur talk without mentioning the many times that they've failed. So one of the things that I like to think about in talking about creating a culture of innovation and what we emphasize at the conference is the concept of fail as being first attempt in learning. And it's a wonderful way to think about the word fail. So I always say to people, it's okay. It's better to fail fast, experiment, than not to have tried at all. And we have a lot of analysis paralysis. So people say, well, how did you start the conference? And I said, well, I just envisaged the end of what it might look like. And I just went out and booked the dates, booked the venue for my very first conference. Like that was 6 years ago now. And I thought to myself, wow, it'd be fantastic to get, ANZ Bank, which is a really big bank here, on board, and like get Edward de Bono. And I just wrote to to Edward de Bono and asked him if he would speak at the conference. And to my amazement, he said yes. And I managed to get the ANZ Bank on board early on. And so they gave me the confidence to actually keep going and start. But I find with a lot of entrepreneurs is they do their whole sort of like risk management plan and go through everything that could go wrong instead of just going, let's just start. Let's just start now. And our conference is very much about people setting up this space where they can just start, and they build a team of people who are collaborators and hopefully not all the same as one another. And we really focus on that cross-pollination in the conference. But also we have some of the world's leading thinkers come. We have people like Ray Kurzweil and Peter Diamandis, who are the founders of Singularity University. We've had people like Ernesto Ciroli and Baroness Susan Greenfield, and many of the leading thinkers in the world, futurists like Thomas Frey and many, many other incredible people. Scott Anthony, who trained with Clayton Christensen, who founded the term disruptive innovation. So many other people who've come to our conference who are just leaders in their field.
Which is amazing. And the thing that stands out in what you've talked about there in terms of that process of developing the conferences is actually not so much the fact that you stepped out and you just gave it a go and you just asked, but actually you knew who you wanted to ask. And I think vision is also a very important part of this process, that sometimes it's great to want to get up and go and take the action, but if you have a very clear vision of who you need to speak to and why you need to speak to that person, that is also a key game changer in terms of making things happen. But I do think that there is definitely a culture among some people to be a little bit afraid to make things happen. So I'm curious, Amelia, from your perspective, what it is that you think kind of holds people back in Europe when it comes to just making it happen.
I agree. I think you need to have a clear vision. And I think what people can see is that if you make it easy for people to help you, people will help you. People want to help, want to feel that they have added value. They want to give back. They all want to do that. They just don't have the time. So if you're very clear about what you want to achieve and you make it very easy and clear how they can support you in what you want to achieve, people will be happy to help, especially if your mission is something that everybody can back up. It's something that is clear and it has a strong voice. But I think we've also kind of underestimated the importance of having fun. I think social media and also the startup community, where everybody is like 20 years old and they have done an exit with a unicorn or two at least, adds some pressure to people. So you see, like, I have friends that are like 22-year-old and they feel they're left behind and they should be, doing business and all that. But if you're too business and too goal-driven, you may miss the fun. And when you miss the fun, you miss out on creating something truly innovative. It's really unique. And I think that's a pity. I think we should allow ourselves the freedom to play, and we should be more focused around our missions and the problems that we want to solve, rather than focusing, I want to have an exit, or I want to be an entrepreneur, or I want to be an investor. So not focusing so much on the end goal, because that can limit our perspective. Focus on our greater mission. I want to build new tools for people to leverage technology, to be more creative, to make their life easier, or I want to support entrepreneurs and companies and help them fulfill their missions, rather than having a narrow vision towards a goal that can make us more narrow-minded, but it can also add a lot of stress in our lives. If you're under stress, there's no way you can be playful and have a sense of humor and play. And I think, what's important to remember is if you're building a startup, it's like 90% that you're most likely to fail. And if you are going to fail with something, it can be at least something fun, like, would you rather fail building a rocket to the moon, or would you rather fail doing an Uber for ants? I'd prefer the first one, to be honest. So if you're going to fail, at least fail at something cool. You shouldn't be afraid to take a risk, but you also shouldn't take yourself too seriously. I think maybe with a lot of the conferences, and we all go to events to hear each other talk, and you get to this point when you're on Twitter and everybody's watching your tweet, your company, and you feel under pressure, and that limits you. It doesn't feel very comfortable in making mistakes in public, but you should have fun.
This is an interesting point, and it's one that I'm going to ask you about, Tanya, which is, We do end up going to an awful lot of events. I know for myself, my entire September, October, November were consumed with conferences and events and speaking at various things and judging or mentoring at various things. And what I'm curious about is, from your perspective, having run, so coming from the other side of the fence, rather than being an attendee, but having organised and run these events for quite some time, what would you say are the keys to real productivity during a conference or an event? Because I find that 9 times out of 10, there's just so much going on that you tend to feel like I didn't quite get everything I could have got out of that event.
Yeah, well, definitely. I've performed and I speak at conferences and events around the world and have for many, many years. And that was the reason why I set up Creative Innovation Global, was because I wanted to create events that would be like world-class, out of the box, unlike any other conference that was around, and that people would leave feeling like so inspired to go back to their workplaces and start to implement what they learned. But the way to do that is absolutely to have fun and creativity as part of the conference program. So what tends to happen at a lot of conferences is a lot of conferences are quite one way. There's a speaker on the stage, there's people tweeting or taking notes below, and there's not enough interaction. But also there's a lot of talking, and our brains get saturated by that, and we spend, as it is, about 85% of the time in our lives in the left side of our brain, our logical, analytical side of our brain. But the most important part of our brain to nurture is the right side of our brain, our creative, intuitive part of our brain, which is like our battery. And we have to charge our battery. So at our conference, we have graphic recorders in residence, divas in residence, and of course, composers in residence and artists in residence, and even sometimes poets in residence, who create moments of creative interaction with the audience, and moments where instead of just listening to verbal talking, you're actually hearing the content and seeing it in a whole new and different way. And actually that means that you absorb a lot more of the content than you would if it was just straight talking the whole time. The other thing that we do is we have a lot of hotspots so that people get up close and personal with the speakers, and they can have discussions with them just in a very small circle instead of just seeing a speaker who's a bit of a star on the stage and who then vanishes. We make sure that anyone who speaks at our conference actually spends some time talking with delegates in a circle, and everyone feels like they're on a level playing field, and that breaks down the silos and barriers between people, and it's a lot of fun. We have a lot of fun at our conferences. This year we got everyone up doing salsa dancing. Another year we got everyone singing, because that taps into the right side of the brain, and it means that people are just experiencing life and learning in a whole different way, and that does spark creativity and innovation.
Interesting. I'm unsure if I'm nervous and afraid to come to one of your conferences now.
No, you've got to come. Just don't worry. You don't have to sing a solo, and you don't have to dance on your own.
Okay, well, that's not so bad then.
I'm down for some
seeing
salsa.
the whole room dancing. Pardon?
I'm down for some salsa anytime.
I bet you are.
But ladies, what I want to ask you is, in the kind of the grand scheme of Digital Jam, and what we normally kind of ask all of our guests at some point in the show, is what you think is going to be that significant change that's going to happen in your industry, or just generalistically within the next kind of 5 to 10 years, whether that's a technological change, whether that's a cultural shift, what you think it is that's going to significantly impact what it is that you do and your industry. And mainly because you've been on the show before, I'm going to ask you this question first.
I think I have to say something different yet again. And this time I'm going to talk about the change in working relationships, which I think it's very important, and it's not really that much talked about. Like, we talk about the future of work, how everybody's going to become a nomad and contract and all that. But what does it mean for working relationships? We've seen Uber go into trials about, if they're really contractors or employees or drivers. I think today there was a great post technology review about what it's like to have an algorithm for a boss, because essentially the way Uber drivers work is heavily influenced by the algorithm behind the application. And I think in general, that whole traveling that we were talking about, the living together spaces and the mix of different talents, I think there are a lot of things that will affect the way people collaborate in the next few years, but it's also going to come as a question about how do you defend working relationships and what will this mean? Because up to now, we had unions, we had people deciding together about how to work with an employee, like if something went wrong. Now whistleblowing policies is different by company. How are we going to find that new balance in working relationships? And we can ensure that everybody can work freely, collaborate with more people, but also make sure that everybody has a fair chance to making a living.
Interesting. The more you talk about this shared living and working space, the more nervous I get about the idea that actually every time you get together with a new group of entrepreneurs about a new business, you're actually going to be having to look at people and think, can I live with this person too? That's quite worrying. But
I think you can maybe choose a place where you live with a singer and a dancer and an entrepreneur, and that's where things will get interesting.
Absolutely. So Tanya, what would you say is going to be that significant change for you and what you do in the next 5 to 10 years?
I also think the whole co-working phenomenon is really interesting, and I'm very excited about the space that we're about to create. I think that'll be really interesting. And I'm really looking forward to seeing who actually signs up and how we're going to create those working relationships. Luckily, though we're building a shower there, we're not providing beds. So
not quite there yet.
Not quite there yet. I'm not quite sure I want to live with my working colleagues. That might be just a little bit much. But the other thing, obviously, that I guess I'm concerned about, as I mentioned earlier, is the amount of people that will be left behind by new technology, that are being left behind by new technology, and how we're going to help those people achieve meaningful contributing lives, and how we're going to include them in society and help them build their capabilities. It's going to be a very interesting 5 years, I think, and a topic probably for a much longer conversation in the future, which I'd love to talk to you about. But that for me is the big question, and I'm not sure that I know the answer. People are talking about, for example, providing annual or monthly incomes to citizens just because there's not going to be enough work around. But then what's going to fuel a person's sense of meaning and purpose? Because now work does define a lot of a person's self-esteem and who they are in the world. So if people don't have a job, what are they going to do, and what's that all going to mean?
Almost brings to question whether or not people like Gene Roddenberry were onto something when they envisioned a Star Trek future where, people didn't have a wage, so to speak, but were free to explore whatever it is that they wanted to explore and become a professional in whichever capacity they wanted to become a professional.
And there could be something really special about that. It could be that people actually do... Oh, sorry, that's the dog. It could be that people get to walk their dogs a lot more if they really love their dogs. Or explore whatever it is that turns them on.
Absolutely. Well, ladies, as always, we like to close out the show by asking you to share your social media handle of choice so that our listeners can find out a little bit more about you, follow you, and figure out just exactly what it is you do. So, Amelia, if you would like to share with us your handle of choice.
My handle anywhere really is AMALUCKY.
And Tanya, what about yourself?
So Tanya de Jong, so at Tanya TANIADEJONG, and Creative Universe and Creative Innovation.
Wonderful. We'll make sure to include those in the notes. But ladies, thank you very much for joining me on this Digital Jam session today. And thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this content and you'd like to hear more, don't forget to subscribe and review. And thanks again for listening to this Digital Jam session. DigitalJamSessions.com